An area that requires some attention is the history of the equipment in our industry. So the history on presses and nomenclature is a bit of what we'll talk about at the moment. Especially since we all want to be on the same page. My father, Robert N. Steffens, wrote 2 handbooks. They were called the Engraved Stationery Handbook. The first edition was this blue copy that was written in the 1950s, and the second edition, which was written in 1968 or so, which updated a lot of the equipment that was used for producing engraved stationery. Both handbooks give information on making plates using a pantograph machine and etching systems. We supplied one of these handbooks with each press until they were gone, and they have a tremendous amount of information in them, and if you can get a copy of it and read it, you'll be way ahead of most everybody else. I personally use the Green Handbook at least once a month still. Presumably nobody here has used varnish inks. Well, there's a whole chapter on running varnish inks. Now, before electricity, hand plate presses, also known as spider presses, and hand stamping presses, better known as ball presses, were used. This was used for producing engraved stationery or cards or security documents. The other forms of printing years ago were litho, letterpress, and maybe others that I'm not familiar with. Litho was not offset litho, it was using a litho stone, so it was direct to paper. Letterpress, everybody knows what that is. It's using a raised type. The engraved stationery required a lot of pressure. The plate press, with a hand ink and hand white plate, received pressure from a roller when turning the spokes or the wheel of the press. The hand stamping press, with a hand inked and wiped die, received pressure by the swinging balls. Around the turn of the last century, that means the beginning of the 1900s, we saw many people design and create powered die stamping presses, which is still the name of the machines that we use today. They are die stamping presses. They are not engraving presses, since engraving implies to cut into a material, whether it be wood, stone, metal of any type. They are better known, our presses are better known as die stamping presses which produce engraved stationery. The people running these machines are die stampers or press operators. The machines are not engraving presses. The operators are not engravers or engraving press operators. Again, engravers are people that either etch or engrave plates that are used in the die stamping press. In fact, the correct process name for the system of engraving and die stamping is known as Intaglio, which should have been used at the outset to differentiate our trade from trophy and other manufacturing people. The word Intaglio that I'm using is most often pronounced Intaglio. It's an Italian word and the G remains silent. I like to use the word intaglio to our associates in this country. That way they know there's a G in the word. Intaglio is world-renowned in the security field, which does a similar operation with the powered plate presses. Die stamping presses are preferable to plate presses because of the parallel platen system, which can produce a heavy embossing. Whereas a plate printing system requires a shallower lines and thicker ink to prevent the ink from being squeezed out at the end of the lines by the roller pressure. All the original die stamping presses were operated by line shafting, where a leather belt drove the flywheel from a common overhead shaft that was run at the end of the shop by some sort of machine or motor. This is why early presses had no motor pedestals, and a lot of companies today still have fabricated motor pedestals or the motor on the floor at the back of a press to run the equipment. The four surviving press manufacturing companies of note were the modern die stamping and plate press company of Belleville, Illinois, which is a suburb of St. Louis. The C.R. Carver Company of Philadelphia. The Whaite and Saville Company of Leeds, England. And the Friedrich Heim Company of Au am Rhein in Germany. Whaite bought the modern die stamping and plate press company from a bank that had foreclosed upon the original company, and we bought it out of receivership in the early 1930s. We took those patterns, drawings, jigs and fixtures, and some castings, and held them in 3 freight cars until 1945, after World War II, when we started manufacturing what were known as the modern presses. At the request of Barta Industries, we bought the C.R. Carver Company, which was also known at some period of time as the Olney Company, and back to the Carver Company, and then eventually the Barta Company. We never manufactured any Carver presses, but we've manufactured every part necessary for a Carver press in existence today. In 1990, at the request of the French die stampers, who were concerned about not being able to buy replacement parts, I bought the Whaite and Saville Company and shipped 17 used presses, all of the replacement parts that were on hand, and all of the drawings, and a lot of jigs and fixtures which were necessary for making the Whaite and Saville presses. The Whaite and Saville presses, around 1945, switched from standard presses where the dies were facing up in the press. They switched to what were known as inverted presses, where the die was facing down. The funeral of the Heim Company was around the early 1980s, and the company just disappeared. The Heim press was a copy of the Whaite and Saville press, and many of the same parts were interchangeable. The main difference being that the imperial system, or inches, were used for the Whaite and Saville press, and the metric system was used on the Heim press. Personally, I felt that the Heim press was better than the Whaite and Saville press in a lot of ways because it had been modified and better. On a note with regards to the Whaite and Saville presses, few companies in the United States use them, but there are 2 or 3 that still remain. They probably have twice the number of parts in each press than we have in ours. The Whaite presses, being the modern or the Carver presses, are easier to operate and have better features. Since we will be talking mainly about the Carver presses and the modern presses, the modern being interchangeable with the word Whaite, I want to describe a bit of the differences between the 2 machines. We have always, since Whaite is the caretaker of the machinery in the engraved stationery industry, we have no prejudice for either machinery, whether it's a Carver or a modern or a Whaite or whatever. However, we have learned that it is difficult to attach an automatic feeder to a Carver press. In fact, they can only be fitted to the 2.5 by 4, the 3 by 8 Carver, or 4 by 8.5, which is the same machine, and the 4.5 by 9 Carver. The other presses are impossible to feed because the throat area restricts a sheet from coming in from the left side. However, the modern presses don't have that difficulty. There's a big difference between the Carver presses and the modern presses. Both press systems do the simple operation of inking, wiping, and stamping. However, the modern presses have time out.